The morning I walked outside and found my truck gone from my own driveway, I honestly thought I was losing my mind. I stood there barefoot on the cold concrete, coffee still in my hand, staring at an empty space where my old silver pickup had been sitting for almost a decade. And for a few seconds, I actually wondered if I had parked it somewhere else the night before. Then I saw the tire marks, the small patch of oil near the curb, and that bright orange towing notice, folded neatly under my front doormat like someone had delivered a bill for a crime I never committed. That was the moment I realized my quiet little neighborhood had just crossed a line that nobody could uncross. My name is Daniel Harper, and I live just outside of Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, in a neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates. It is the kind of place people move to when they want peace. 26 brick houses sitting around a winding cul-de-sac, identical mailboxes, trimmed lawns, little American flags by the porches, and enough neighborhood rules to make you wonder if you bought a house or accidentally joined a private government. Now, I am not one of those people who hates HOAs. I actually understood why they existed. Nobody wants their neighbor leaving broken furniture in the front yard or painting their house neon green overnight. Rules can protect a community, and when everyone plays fair, they can work. But somewhere along the way, our HOA stopped being about keeping the neighborhood nice and started becoming about giving certain people a little taste of power. My house was at the end of the street, the last one before the trees and open fields started. It was a simple red brick home my father helped build back in 1991. He poured the driveway himself, mixing concrete under the Oklahoma sun with his old work boots covered in dust. He always told me, a man's home should be the one place where he doesn't have to ask permission to breathe. I never forgot that. Parked in that driveway was my 2014 Ford F-150. Nothing fancy, nothing that would turn heads at a car show, but it was mine. I kept it clean, maintained it, paid the registration, and never once blocked the sidewalk or caused trouble. For years, that truck sat in the exact same spot, and nobody cared. Then came Marcus Bell, our new HOA president. Marcus was the kind of guy who looked like he practiced being important in the mirror, always wearing expensive polo shirts, polished shoes, and those reflective sunglasses that made him look like he was permanently waiting for someone to interview him. When he first got elected, he talked about improving the neighborhood. He said he wanted consistency, discipline, and community standards. Those words sounded harmless. Most people nodded along, but within a few months, little things started changing. A neighbor got a warning because his trash cans were visible from the street by 6 inches. Another received a letter because his mailbox flower arrangement was not aligned with the neighborhood aesthetic. Everyone laughed at first because it seemed ridiculous, but then people stopped laughing. They started checking over their shoulders before mowing their own lawns. Still, I never thought Marcus would come after my truck until that July morning. I called the towing company listed on the notice, and the woman on the phone casually told me my vehicle had been removed because it violated the neighborhood parking policy. I asked her what policy. She said, no overnight parking in driveways. I remember laughing because I genuinely thought she had the wrong person. I said, "Ma'am, that truck was parked in my driveway, not on the street." She replied, "You need to talk to your HOA." That was when my stomach tightened. I walked outside and saw Marcus standing halfway down the sidewalk, holding a clipboard like he was inspecting a construction site. He looked completely relaxed, almost proud. I walked toward him and asked, "Did you have my truck towed?" He adjusted his sunglasses and said, "Daniel, let's not make this dramatic. The rules apply to everyone." I looked back at my empty driveway and said, "The rule that lets you remove my vehicle from my property?" He smiled slightly and said, "The no overnight driveway parking amendment. It went into effect last week." Something about the way he said it bothered me. Not the words themselves, but the confidence behind them. Like he expected me to accept whatever he said because he wore the title of president. I asked him why nobody received a notice, why there was no meeting, and why nobody voted on it. Marcus just shrugged and said, "Maybe you should read the handbook more carefully." That sentence stayed with me all day. Because I knew my father. I knew that driveway. I knew every crack in that concrete. And I knew something was wrong. That evening, instead of paying the towing fee and moving on like Marcus probably expected me to do, I sat at my kitchen table with the HOA documents spread out in front of me. I grabbed a flashlight because the lighting in my dining room was terrible, and I started reading every page line by line. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for the truth. And somewhere between those pages, I had a feeling I was going to find the one thing Marcus never expected me to find, the proof that his biggest rule wasn't a rule at all. I spent almost the entire night going through those HOA documents, and the strange thing was, the more I read, the less angry I became and the more curious I got. Because anger makes people act fast, but curiosity makes people look closer. And when I looked closer, I started noticing something that bothered me even more than the tow itself. Marcus Bell wasn't just enforcing a rule. He was creating the appearance of a rule. There was a difference, and that difference mattered. I pulled out every document I had from the HOA, every annual update, every meeting summary, every amendment notice that had ever been mailed to residents. I was looking for one simple thing. A record showing that the community had actually approved a ban on overnight driveway parking, but it wasn't there. Not a single page, no vote, no signature, no official notice, nothing. The rule Marcus claimed existed was like a ghost. Everyone had heard about it because he said it existed, but nobody could actually prove it did. Around midnight, I called my neighbor Linda Morales. She lived 3 houses down and had always been one of the more reasonable people in the neighborhood. She answered half asleep and asked if everything was okay. I told her what happened with my truck, and there was a long silence on the phone. Then she said, "Wait, he towed your truck from your driveway?" I could hear the surprise in her voice. Not anger at first, just disbelief. She told me Marcus had sent her a warning letter 2 weeks earlier about her husband's work van being parked overnight, but they ignored it because they thought it was just another one of his unnecessary complaints. That was when I realized I wasn't the first person he had tried this with. My truck was just the first time he had actually crossed the line far enough for someone to push back. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office. I had never been the type of person who enjoyed dealing with paperwork. Honestly, if someone had told me a year earlier that I would spend my Saturday morning reading property records because of a neighborhood parking dispute, I probably would have laughed. But there I was, sitting under fluorescent lights in a government building that smelled like old paper and printer ink, waiting for someone to tell me whether I was crazy or whether my HOA president had made a very expensive mistake. A clerk named Evelyn helped me search through the recorded documents. She was probably in her late 50s, the kind of person who had seen every possible neighborhood argument come through those doors. After a few minutes of scrolling through records, she looked over her glasses and said, "I'm not seeing anything here about HOA authority over private driveway parking restrictions." I asked her if maybe it was filed somewhere else. She checked again. Then she shook her head. If this restriction was created properly, there would be documentation, an amendment, a record, something. She paused and added, "Right now, I don't see anything." That sentence hit me harder than I expected, because deep down, I already knew Marcus was wrong, but hearing it from someone who had no connection to the neighborhood made it real. I wasn't just arguing with a difficult neighbor. I was dealing with someone who had decided his position gave him power he didn't actually have. When I got home, I didn't call Marcus. I didn't yell. I didn't post anything online. I knew people like him. They feed off emotional reactions because it lets them paint themselves as the reasonable one. Instead, I started building a file. I contacted the city zoning department and asked about HOA enforcement authority. They explained that private communities could create certain rules, but those rules still had to follow proper procedures and couldn't simply override property rights without legal foundation. Then I reached out to the Oklahoma Real Estate Commission. I explained what happened, sent copies of the towing notice, and provided the HOA documents. A few days later, I received a response that changed everything. They confirmed that the towing action appeared unauthorized because the HOA had no recorded authority for the restriction Marcus claimed existed. They also explained that removing a legally parked vehicle from private property could create serious liability issues. I printed every email, every confirmation, every document. By the time I finished, I had a folder sitting on my desk that was almost an inch thick. Inside were 7 pages of information that told a very different story than the one Marcus had been telling everyone. But the hardest part wasn't proving I was right. The hardest part was deciding what to do next. Because I knew once I challenged him publicly, there was no going back. This wasn't just about getting my $375 towing fee back. It was about every neighbor who had quietly accepted warnings because they didn't want conflict. It was about the people who were afraid to speak because someone with a title had convinced them they had no choice. So I waited for the next HOA meeting. When that evening finally came, I walked into the community clubhouse carrying my folder. The room was exactly how I expected it to be. Folding chairs, cheap coffee, neighbors sitting quietly, pretending they weren't curious about why I had brought documents. Marcus was at the front table, wearing the same confident expression he always wore. He looked at my folder and smiled. "Daniel, I hope this isn't going to be another misunderstanding." I sat down and said, "No, Marcus, I think this is the first time we're actually going to understand each other." He laughed softly, like he already knew he had won. Then the meeting started. They discussed landscaping complaints, budget updates, and other routine HOA business. Marcus moved through everything quickly, clearly wanting the evening to end. Finally, during the open discussion period, I stood up. The room got quiet. I placed my folder on the table in front of him. "I'd like to discuss the parking amendment you used to tow my truck." Marcus leaned back and said, "We've already covered this." I opened the folder and slid the first document across the table. "Actually, we haven't, because this amendment doesn't exist." The room changed instantly. A few neighbors looked at each other. Marcus picked up the paper and glanced at it. Then he smiled. "You're not an attorney, Daniel?" I nodded. "No, I'm not. But I can read." A couple of people laughed quietly. His expression tightened. I continued explaining that there was no recorded amendment, no proper vote, and no authority allowing him to order the tow. Marcus tried to interrupt several times, saying I was misunderstanding the rules. But every time he did, I placed another document on the table: the city response, the records search, the state guidance. Piece by piece, the confidence started disappearing from his face. Finally, he looked at me and said the one thing I knew he would say: "You're bluffing." I closed the folder slowly and looked around the room. Then I said, "No, Marcus, I'm filing a formal complaint." For the first time since I met him, he had nothing to say, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. But I also knew the real fight had just started. Because people like Marcus don't usually surrender when they lose an argument, they usually find out the hard way that the law doesn't care about their title. 2 weeks after that HOA meeting, I was sitting in my garage changing the oil on my truck when I saw a black SUV slowly roll into our neighborhood and stop in front of the clubhouse. Now in Willow Creek Estates, a stranger pulling into the neighborhood usually meant one of 3 things: a delivery driver trying to find a house, a lost contractor, or someone looking at a property for sale. Nobody expected a government vehicle. Nobody expected an investigation. But then a woman stepped out carrying a leather folder and wearing the kind of expression that told me she wasn't there to talk about landscaping or mailbox colors. Her name was Rachel Whitmore, and she was the state investigator assigned to review the complaint I had filed against the HOA. I remember standing there with an oily rag in my hand, looking at her walk toward the clubhouse, and thinking about how strange the whole situation had become. A month earlier, my biggest concern had been whether I needed new tires before winter. I was just a guy who wanted to park his truck in his own driveway. I wasn't trying to start a neighborhood war. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I wasn't trying to become the person everyone talked about at the mailbox. I simply wanted someone to explain why they thought they had the right to take something that belonged to me. But sometimes, When you stand up for something small, you discover it was never really small at all. Rachel spent the next several hours reviewing everything. She looked through the HOA records, examined the towing notice, reviewed the documents I provided, and spoke with several homeowners. What surprised me was how many people suddenly had stories of their own, things they had never mentioned before, things they had accepted because they thought fighting back would be too exhausting. Linda told Rachel about the warning letter she received over her husband's work van. Another neighbor explained how he had paid a fine because Marcus claimed his front porch decorations violated community standards, even though nobody could point to the actual rule. A retired couple mentioned they had removed a small garden bench because Marcus told them it wasn't approved, only to later discover there was no written restriction against it. One story after another started coming out, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Marcus hadn't just made one mistake with my truck. He had created an environment where people were afraid to question him. And the most frustrating part was that many of those people weren't even angry at him anymore. They were angry at themselves for staying quiet. I understood that feeling because I almost did the same thing. There was a moment after my truck was towed when I considered just paying the $375, picking it up, and forgetting the whole thing. It would have been easier. A lot easier. I could have told myself it wasn't worth the stress. I could have said, it's just a neighborhood rule. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the real issue. The issue wasn't my truck. The issue was that someone had decided my silence was permission. And once someone believes that, they usually don't stop on their own. The next HOA meeting was unlike any meeting I'd ever attended. Usually those meetings were quiet. People sat in the back, listened to announcements, nodded politely, and went home. This time, the room felt different before anyone even spoke. People were sitting forward. They were talking to each other. They were asking questions. The fear was gone. Marcus arrived about 10 minutes late, and I noticed something I had never seen before. He looked uncomfortable. Normally, he walked into that room like he owned it. He would place his papers on the table, adjust his chair, and wait for everyone to follow his lead. But that night, he looked around and realized the room wasn't waiting for him anymore. Rachel stood up and explained the findings. Her voice was calm and professional, which somehow made every word hit harder. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She simply explained the facts. The parking restriction had not been properly approved. The towing action had no legal foundation. The HOA had acted beyond its authority. Marcus tried to interrupt several times. He said there had been confusion. He said everyone misunderstood his intentions. He said he was only trying to maintain property values and protect the neighborhood, and maybe part of him actually believed that. That's the complicated thing about people who abuse authority. They don't always wake up thinking they're the villain. Sometimes they convince themselves they're the only person willing to do what's necessary. They tell themselves everyone else is too careless, too lazy, or too uninformed to understand the bigger picture. But good intentions don't erase bad decisions. And being responsible for a community doesn't mean you own the people living in it. At one point, Marcus looked directly at me and said, "Daniel, you turned a simple parking issue into a major problem." I remember looking around the room before answering him, because that sentence revealed everything. In his mind, the problem wasn't that my truck was removed without permission. The problem was that I refused to accept it quietly. I said, "No, Marcus. The parking issue was simple. You made it complicated when you decided the rules didn't apply to you." Nobody said anything for a few seconds. It was one of those moments where the entire room understood the same thing at the same time. The board members who had supported him began asking questions of their own. They wanted to know why they had never seen the amendment. They wanted to know who approved the towing company. They wanted to know why residents were being fined under rules that apparently didn't exist. Marcus didn't have clear answers anymore. The confidence that once carried him through every conversation was gone. The same person who had told me rules are rules was now struggling to explain which rules he was actually talking about. By the end of that meeting, the board called for a formal vote, and when the votes were counted, Marcus Bell was removed as HOA president unanimously. Not one person voted to keep him. That moment was probably the quietest victory I have ever witnessed. There was no cheering, no dramatic celebration, just a room full of neighbors realizing they had finally taken their community back. Over the following weeks, everything changed. The towing policy was eliminated completely. The HOA refunded the money collected from improper enforcement actions. The new board reviewed old rules and started the process of making sure every regulation was properly documented and legally approved. But the biggest change wasn't written on paper. It was the way people treated each other. Neighbors who used to avoid conversations started sitting outside together again. People stopped worrying about whether someone was watching their every move. The neighborhood slowly became what it was supposed to be in the first place, a place where people lived, not a place where people felt monitored. A few days after everything was settled, I parked my truck back in its usual spot. Same driveway, same concrete my father poured decades earlier, same old Ford sitting under the Oklahoma sun, and I remember standing there for a minute, just looking at it, because that truck represented more than transportation. It represented a line that someone tried to cross and a reminder that sometimes ordinary people have to defend ordinary things, not because those things are valuable, but because what they represent is your home, your choices, your right to be treated fairly. Looking back now, I don't hate HOAs. I still believe communities need rules. I still believe neighbors should respect each other. But rules only work when they are created fairly and enforced honestly. The moment someone starts believing their position gives them unlimited power, everyone loses. And maybe that's the lesson I took away from all of this. Power rarely disappears because someone gives it up willingly. Sometimes, it disappears because someone finally asks the question nobody wanted to ask. Who gave you the right? So now, I want to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have fought back, knowing it could create months of stress and conflict? Or would you have paid the towing fee and moved on? Do you think Marcus was a person trying too hard to protect his neighborhood? Or did he cross the line the moment he used authority he didn't have? Share your thoughts in the comments because these community battles are rarely just about a truck, a driveway, or a rule book. They're about trust, fairness, and where the line should be between keeping order and controlling people. If you enjoyed this story, share it with someone who has ever dealt with a difficult HOA, and subscribe for more stories about everyday people who decided that sometimes standing up for yourself is the only way to make things right.